Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar Alcohol Policy Series number 1, Restrictions on Advertising and Community Events. Your webinar host today is the Great Lakes PTTC. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are all funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA, and at the time of the presentation, the opinions expressed are the views of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official position of DHHS or SAMHSA. We are all funded under these cooperative agreements. And again, we want to thank you for joining us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. There is no call-in number available, and this audio will be broadcast through your computer speakers. So please make sure that your speakers are turned on and up. This webinar will be recorded. The recording and presentations will be available on the PTTC website within 1 to 2 weeks. There are no CEUs or certificates of attendance for this webinar, and we will have a question and answer session after the presentations have been recorded and posted on our website, and you will get that information in an email. Today's presenters are Chuck Klevgaard and Kelly Henrichs. Chuck delivers training and technical assistance to support substance misuse prevention through the Midwest. He has supported communities and health agencies as they adopt evidence-based alcohol, opioid, and other substance misuse programs and policies. Chuck also serves as a prevention manager to the Great Lakes Prevention Technology Transfer Center. He earned his BSW from Minnesota State University Moorhead, and he is a certified senior prevention specialist through the Illinois Certification Board, and we are lucky to have him today. Kelly Henrichs is the Alcohol Policy Resource Center Director at Prevention First. Kelly Henrichs is the Program Manager for the Alcohol Policy Research Center Prevention First. Kelly brings over 2 decades of successful experience in substance misuse prevention and policy work. She is a subject matter expert in youth prevention, education, communication campaigns, strategic planning, and community coalitions. Kelly regularly provides training and technical assistance to providers throughout Illinois. Kelly also works with communities to reduce underage drinking by analyzing data, identifying contributing factors, implementing policy efforts, and engaging law enforcement. A strong believer that communities have the power to create change, Kelly works to empower key stakeholders, community leaders, and coalitions to work together to address underage drinking. When Kelly's not working, she enjoys spending time with her husband and teenage children, experiencing the adventures and misadventures that life has to offer. Welcome, both of you, and I'll turn this over to Chuck.
All right. Thank you, Ann, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As you heard a moment ago, this is part of a series. This is part 1. Today we'll be talking about restrictions on advertising regarding alcohol, as well as restrictions on alcohol at community events. Know that this is in part a follow-up to an earlier introduction to environmental strategies that we did that you can find on the Great Lakes PTTC site and listen to that recording if you all missed that initial recording and want to review the basics. So today we're going to spend some time talking about the typical elements associated with restrictions on advertising as well. We're going to talk about some of those same kind of basic elements about restrictions on alcohol at events. We're going to look at some of the outcomes. So I'll start today by reminding, again, a quick review of what we covered in that first webinar that was the basics, the overview about environmental strategies. These kinds of strategies aim to change or influence community standards, institutions, structures, attitudes that shape behavior. So rather than individual type programs like life skills or parenting initiatives, these kinds of programs are aimed directly at changing community conditions. We spent time in that talking about categories of environmental strategies involving communication, education, policy adoption, where we're going to be spending time today, and enforcement and how those work together. So again, invite you all to review that and think about that as we move into a very specific area today in terms of looking at policy. Again, some basic ways of thinking about policy. Knows that there has been a great deal of sort of evidence for the ways in which policy can reduce underage drinking and associated consequences. Examples include looking at the minimum legal drinking age and the way in which that, again, sort of impacted prevention goals as well as changed negative outcomes in terms of consequences for young people. The quick overview about policy as we move into this, again, would include kind of what the research says about it. Increasing the price of alcohol has shown to be effective. Providing deterrence to using alcohol has been a part of what we're learning about policy. Restricting use and sale of alcohol can be effective in both reducing early use or use at all by young people. Restricting advertising that targets young people is effective, and we're going to spend more time there today. Looking at educating the public about enforcement and holding adults accountable all show effective outcomes with regard to policy. Advertising restrictions is where we're going to zero in at the first part of this webinar today, in particular looking at advertising that exposes young people to pro-alcohol messages. We'll look at those in different forms, and again, we're going to talk about the main objective here is to reduce youth exposure to any pro-alcohol messages. Typical elements of this kind of a policy involve some of a process to oversee the proposing or new amending restrictions, looking at and having some oversight with folks who have this kind of expertise has been part of what we know is an important consideration if you're going to implement this kind of policy. Again, looking at legal expertise is part of this. So we'll know that, again, that this sort of restrictions can take many forms, as I mentioned a moment ago, everything from banning advertising on public transportation to limiting advertising at events, and then again, banning advertising in surrounding areas where young people are, in particular schools, residential areas, or faith communities. Other elements would include restricting local agency websites, looking at issues of where the placement of window advertising, looking at total advertising space, looking again at the disproportionate number of billboards in specific neighborhoods, understanding sort of the disparities and the equity issues around how certain groups are targeted for advertising more than others. Important to know how that looks in your community. Again, good news, alcohol regulations have been associated with lower prevalence and frequency of alcohol consumption, and older age of first use, again, which I mentioned a moment ago. All good outcomes, both partial bans, complete bans associated with this, lots of evidence there, and we're citing this kind of evidence, and we're going to give you a handout today that gives you all of what I just covered in terms of outcomes. It's going to provide you with that sort of overview about the research and what we know and what are those important elements. So with all that in mind, know that I spoke quickly through that, but we're going to give it to you in a handout. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Hendricks from the Alcohol Policy Center to talk to you about this policy on the ground.
Well, hello, everyone. I am Kelly Hendricks, and I'm joining you today from the middle of Illinois, where the weather is desperately trying to change from winter into spring. So hopefully warm weather finds you where you're at and sunny days. I want to take the opportunity to thank the Great Lakes Prevention Technology and Transfer Center, as well as SAMHSA, for the opportunity to talk with you today about alcohol advertisement restrictions. Hopefully our discussion around advertising restrictions will help you avoid that feeling of being the goldfish jumping into shark-infested waters. And this webinar provides you with kind of a starting point, a high-level overview, and an opportunity to learn more. Hopefully you'll move on from today and continue learning about advertising restrictions. And I do want to mention that, not all information does carry across all 6 states within the Great Lakes PTTC, especially given we do have control states within the group. So please and always, check with your state, your local laws and ordinances, and that's just a great place to begin. So let's start by talking about some challenges that can come with advertising restrictions. So I remember way back into the 1980s. It was my senior year in high school. And it was a big deal when the yearbook came out. And when I got the yearbook, I remember all of my friends, we were sitting around together and we read the title cover, and it said, "The more things change, the more things stay the same." And that just seemed like such wisdom at the time. And that phrase has actually stayed with me and provided a theme for many life events and initiatives that I've been involved in. And it's fair to say that when it comes to alcohol and advertising restrictions, the more things change, the more they stay the same. While I think we can agree that how youth are exposed to alcohol advertising has changed over time, one thing that certainly remains the same, though, is that youth are overexposed to alcohol advertising at all times. The overexposure comes via billboards, television, magazines, radio, even on buses with bus ads, special events ads, videos. And then there's the ever-present social media that's accessible through laptops, tablets, smartphone apps, and even games. The 2018 Pew Research Center's Teens, Social Media, and Technology study shows that 95% of teens have access to a smartphone. And I find, this next part pretty scary, that, 45% of youth will self-report that they are online constantly. YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat reign supreme. Advertising of all sorts exists on these platforms, and teens do absorb each and every piece of information they hear, see, and read. Now, the First Amendment and free speech is limited for advertising restrictions and regulations, and commercial speech is protected under the First Amendment. Regulations of alcohol advertising are subject to very careful review. Commercial speech is generally defined as speech that's designed to, convince a target audience to purchase a good or a service so that a business or an individual can make a profit. Alcohol advertising as commercial speech is protected under the First Amendment as long as it does not promote unlawful activity and is not misleading. So general prohibited practices for alcohol advertisement include, first and foremost, you can't have statements that are misleading, false, or untrue. You can't have indecent or obscene representations, designs, or statements, and statements falsely heralding the health benefits of alcohol are obviously prohibited. But these are just a few. Typically, when communities or coalitions start talking about alcohol and advertisement restrictions, it can incite fear very quickly. Alcohol advertising can be regulated if the government demonstrates that its regulation advances a significant government interest and it narrowly draws it so not to restrict anyone's speech unnecessarily. So I'm with you at this point. It seems pretty complicated and challenging to maneuver all the subtleties of the law. And sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And that can lead to a run-in with the industry's legal team, whose pockets are pretty deep. So it is critical to learn as much as possible about alcohol restrictions. And while today provides this very introductory experience, you will want to invest more time to learn as much as you can. The second challenge I've noted is that the alcohol industry relies heavily on self-regulation. And self-regulation is a tricky thing. It's completely voluntary, and typically there's a lack of consequences and accountability. And I always tell myself when I go to the grocery store that I can buy the bigger bag of M&Ms because it's cheaper, and I'll only eat half the bag. But it just really doesn't usually go so well. Self-regulation is a challenge. The alcohol industry spends upwards of $2 billion on advertising each year. And when it comes to that advertising, the industry is responsible for regulating itself. And that does seem a little bit backwards. Advertising by the alcohol industry is largely governed by these voluntary guidelines that are set by the 3 alcohol-related trade associations. So, the Beer Institute, the Wine Institute, and the Distilled Spirit Council of the U.S. Now, these guidelines can offer some regulation of when alcohol advertisements can be broadcast,
sometimes you'll see that there is an age verification process to enter a website. You can enter really any birth date, though. And, the alcohol industry should not be advertising alcohol in markets if it's more than 30% of the primary audience that would be underage. But this is tough because one thing we've learned is that even if you have a TV show you've created that you're intending to be an adult audience, oftentimes young people can be drawn to that. So it's really hard to know, and there isn't a widely recognized tool to assess, who really makes up an advertisement's audience. And you're already starting to see some of the loopholes and the vagueness of these guidelines. So federal law does step in to regulate alcohol advertising with false advertising claims, and if there's a lack of warnings put on a product's label. But beyond that, it's really incredibly challenging to prevent alcohol advertising that targets youth or to create a process to really impose those consequences. Now, another challenge I want to talk about is that youth are exposed to an excessive amount of alcohol advertising. And we see the results of youth overexposure to alcohol quite often. It's invasive and it takes over in spaces that are associated with sports, concerts, movies, and even special events. Try watching the Super Bowl without being inundated with alcohol ads. This year, the Big Bowl Vote, created by the Prevention Action Alliance, actually out of Ohio, they surveyed middle and high school students about which Super Bowl advertisement was their favorite. And they voted the Bud Light ad was their favorite. It was the one that featured Post Malone, who really is probably not terribly relevant to people my age, but it certainly does to catch the attention of young people. And the overexposure goes beyond television, though. A study published in the May 2016 Journal of Studies of Alcohol and Drugs found that kids ages 11 to 14 typically saw 2 to 4 alcohol ads per day. And while some of these were TV ads, a lot of them were outdoor ads, billboards, signs outside of stores and restaurants, and those are becoming more prominent. So those of us working to reduce underage drinking, we know the risks that, come with overexposure to alcohol advertising. Evidence from long-term studies tells us that a greater exposure to alcohol advertising does contribute to an increase in drinking among underage youth. Exposure to alcohol advertising shapes attitudes and perceptions and can help predict young people's positive expectancies and intentions to drink. And youth consume alcohol brands of the products they're exposed to through advertising. And even when these advertisements are really sophisticated and they don't even feature a specific product to buy, young people are exposed to that brand. And one thing we're seeing is that young people are actually becoming very brand loyal. And that's based on what they're seeing and what they're exposed to. So they're picking up on those subtleties even when they're not really supposed to. So going along with overexposure is another challenge. Many teens lack the media literacy skills to become engaged and critical media consumers. Media education is the process through which individuals become media literate. They're able to critically understand the nature, the techniques that advertisers are using, and the impact that a message can have. And media literacy encourages young people to question, to really review and assess, and to understand and appreciate their multimedia culture. It teaches them to become informed, engaged media consumers and users. And media literacy also helps young people question media representation, helping them distinguish between what is real and what is fantasy. And this is a critical life skill that all young people need to be exposed to and develop. Alcohol advertising allows for teachable moments and these really rich discussions around questions about, who created this ad? Who do you think paid for this advertisement? Why did they create this? What is the message that the advertisement is trying to make you believe? What isn't the ad saying? And it's really about the questions you can pose and not so much about the answers, but just having a lot of questions. Many students may have access to developing their media literacy skills in high school through a business, maybe a marketing class, a family studies class, but it's really important for all young people, and even those who are younger than high school too, to have opportunities to develop their media literacy skills and become very educated consumers. So lastly, a challenge that I've noted is, it can be frustrating and it can be time-consuming and challenging to bring together all the needed necessary parties for policy change. And I'll tell you up front, policy work is challenging work, and it's very time-consuming work. It's some of the most intense work that I have done in my career. With policy work, it's generally not about one or two people making decisions and carrying the workload. It's about a coalition or a group of people who are coalescing around a shared policy goal. And coalitions can be formal, they can be informal, and they can even be kind of task force in nature, where you're coming together and convening to address one issue, but you're likely not to work together after that issue. If you're looking to have influence over a policy issue, you need to bring the right people to the table. And that's going to be the support of multiple stakeholders through your community. You want to have local politicians on board. You want to make sure you know who your local liquor commissioner or your liquor review board members are. And make sure you're reaching out to them and that they're aware of and involved in your efforts. And bringing everyone together can be really challenging, and it's important to meet people where they're at. Coalitions focused on policy often have participant levels. You may have somebody who you would consider an auxiliary participant who has a very specific time frame they're involved in with the coalition and a very specific purpose. You may have some principal participants who really are involved throughout the process and at varying levels in involvement. But you really want to make sure you find that, that perfect fit for each coalition member. And you'll want to have that vast representation of stakeholders in your community. You want them on board, and this does take time. So a lot of times people want to hit the ground running and, it'll take us a couple days to put together our coalition. But stepping back from that and really making sure you take the time needed to bring those players together, educate them, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So lastly, to achieve policy goals, education and advocacy is often necessary to increase that public support of your efforts. You'll want to influence the decision makers, and you're wanting to increase awareness as well. While these take time, I can promise you it's time that you spend up front, but it will save you on the back end of that policy work. So we have talked a little bit about the challenges, but I don't want to leave you there. I do want to take you to, kind of the sunny side of the road and help you see that although there are some challenges, there's a lot of people who have been working on alcohol and advertising restrictions for a really long time, and there's been a lot of lessons learned along the way. So moving ahead, we can go ahead and take a look at some of those lessons learned. And one thing that has always struck me with any time Okay. Did you guys hear that?
I did.
Yes,
it sounds like an emergency alert. Yeah.
Okay, so that was every phone in the house, every cell phone in the house going off with an Illinois emergency. So there were some quick kind of heads up on the challenges. And there are a lot of challenges. I mean, we are talking about the First Amendment, so, you know, we want to make sure that we are thoughtful about how we go about our policy work. But the good news is, you know, there are a lot of people who have been working on alcohol and advertising restrictions for a long time, and a lot of lessons have been learned, and we can share those lessons with each other to really make things a little bit easier along the way. So the first lesson learned is that many times you don't have to start at the very beginning. You know, while it might feel like you have to start at the very beginning, often communities have created some alcohol advertising restrictions in their community's liquor code or perhaps in their municipal signage codes. So a good place to begin with really any type of policy advocacy and policy change is to complete an inventory of the current language in your municipal code surrounding alcohol advertising and signage. You know, find out what's in that code, if anything, and identify if you're needing to fully create a policy or if maybe there's an advertising restriction or signage language in there, but there's just not awareness or public knowledge of it. It could be that the language is there, there's just no enforcement of what the code says. And oftentimes it's just there's a lack of clarity. And you need to go in there and really add some specifics to the language so everyone understands what the language says. You know, so really don't jump into policy work without doing your homework first, and spend that time researching and getting the information up front. We know that environmental scanning and assessment data allow you to create a clear picture of alcohol in your community. And I'm a huge advocate of data-driven decision-making. And sometimes you might find community members or coalitions, they'll hear about an issue or a program, and, you know, such and such a community is doing this program, and it sounds fantastic. They'll hear about a policy effort that a neighboring community is working on and decide, well, we should be doing that too, right? The problem with that we all know is that funding is limited and communities are different. You know, even side-by-side communities are different. Evidence-based programs and practices and policies are essential. We know data matters, and communities, coalitions, and stakeholders can really only take on so many issues at a time. So it's important to make sure any policy issues you're taking on are really priorities in your community. And right now, there are a lot of substance use issues that communities are focused on. You know, Illinois recently legalized cannabis. You know, vaping is a concern for just about every state. We hear about opioids' devastating effect on communities with methamphetamine concerns, you know, continuing. While communities must deal with these issues, we also need to make sure we're keeping an eye on alcohol because it's a clear and present danger for our young people. Having assessment data and a clear picture of the alcohol landscape in your community creates the foundation for the policy work that you're doing. You know, we do need local data that helps identify what our local problems are. We want to know what factors are contributing to local underage drinking. And alcohol policy efforts can impact excessive alcohol advertising and extensive alcohol promotion. But your data really needs to first show that these are critical issues in your community. Environmental scanning allows you to identify your community's risk factors that can contribute to underage or excessive alcohol consumption. When you conduct an environmental scan, you go into your community and you observe and document information about alcohol in relation to price, product, promotion, and placement, so the 4 Ps. Of most interesting in advertising restrictions would be information collected on alcohol promotion. So things like the prevalence of signs that are advertising alcohol, you know, the prevalence of signs that are safety or warning in nature. So, you know, when you walk into a business and it says no sale to minors or we card or we ID, you'll want to take inventory of how many of those signs you see. Where are the ads placed? What type of advertisements are you seeing? And what kind of alcohol product types are available? Taking what you learned from your community environmental scan and you pair it with your assessment data, you know, such as youth survey data on your past 30-day use, which is really the most accurate information on the behavior that's currently occurring, You'll also want to take a look at past year use, age of first use of alcohol, and potentially heavy consumption and binge drinking data. This data will give us a peek into the consumption patterns and really help prioritize local substance-related problems. So you take your community data, you prioritize your problem, and then you can select those strategies that address the contributing factor. And sometimes it's hard to put the brakes on coalition members because they hear something and they want to run with it, but we want to make sure we're using that process, data, to prioritize the problem, and then select our strategies. So before jumping in, it's critical to make sure that you have the data to support your policy efforts. And although challenging, you will need the support of stakeholders, decision makers, and community members. I mentioned it as a challenge, but it's also a lesson learned. I remember, very early on with policy work thinking if I would stick with a skeleton crew, it'd be easier to really kind of keep tabs on everyone, keep everyone motivated, keep communication moving smoothly. But I very, very quickly learned that for policy efforts to be successful, we really need to have stakeholders, sector representatives, and as many partners as we can at the table. So really investing that time and knowing it's a challenge, but it's really important towards the work that we're going to do. And I mentioned this also, something that, I feel deeply is that policy work can take time, but it's really worth it. And, sometimes depending on the issue or the community, it can take a whole lot of time. But here again, you're having the opportunity to really work in your community to change outcomes. And policy work is a process. There's many steps. There's a lot of sub-steps. There's tasks, responsibilities. You're having to get on meeting agendas with your partners. You're waiting to get on the agenda with the city council or the liquor commission. There's a lot of steps that we're putting into place. The other part of it is you're likely relying on a workforce that is volunteer in nature. But if you know and you help coalition members understand when they go into policy work, but this isn't a sprint in any way. This is by far a marathon. It's probably an ultra marathon. Everybody's going to have a better frame of mind as that work continues. You want to make sure you celebrate and acknowledge those small steps forward. While your overall goal is policy adoption, there's a multitude of small steps along the way that are going to propel you forward and bring about success. And you really do want to celebrate all of those. You want to look at other ways to accomplish your goal. And this is something that has been incredibly powerful when it comes to work we've done with advertising restrictions. Sometimes there's just more than one way to go about achieving your goal. And you can do this with advertising restrictions. Sometimes what you'll find is that you'll say, we want to reduce underage drinking through advertising restrictions. And people will listen, but it's not something they feel very passionate about. And Baltimore was the first to enact a youth presence outdoor alcohol advertising ordinance. It provided that, with certain exceptions, billboards could not be placed in residential areas. And the ordinance went as far as to make a very sharp distinction between locations where young people routinely congregate and areas where kids are less likely to congregate. So they tailored it very clearly to reduce youth exposure without restricting any adult viewing. And that's how we can go about this is, oftentimes community members are worried about the effects on young people, but maybe they're worried more about the aesthetically distasteful advertisements in a business. They're just all over it. It takes away from how our neighborhoods look and how our downtown looks. Well, you can pair this with your efforts. You might hear from community members, well, we see all this litter and graffiti, and we're concerned about the safety of our businesses. And you can pair that with your efforts. Content-neutral advertising are restrictions that really, it doesn't matter what they're advertising, you're restricting everything. All right. So you're not just asking about the removal of or the reduction of only alcohol advertisements, you're asking for a reduction in all advertisements, and this is regardless of product. Again, you can leverage the community's interest in creating a more aesthetically pleasing retail environment, or the community's support of a concept called natural surveillance. And natural surveillance is the approach to increasing visibility into a retail business for safety reasons. So it could mean that there's less advertising in the front windows, that only a certain percentage of space can be used up. It could mean that there's better visibility in the parking lots and less signage in entrances. Oftentimes, there will be language that there should be a clear view into the retail establishment to see the cash registers at all times. And this reduces advertisements. So the more you look to change the content of the advertising, the more likely you're going to really encounter that challenge to commercial speech. Now, parents wield a special power. And while stakeholders and community coalitions are focused on policy initiatives, it is important to acknowledge that parents are a powerful force. And while we can't control young people's decisions, we can help them make more positive choices. And the subject of underage drinking, you just can't be taboo anymore. And conversations need to happen as to, what the boundaries are, what the expectations, rules are in a household. And here again, helping students develop those media literacy skills. While not directly related to actual policy work, it's important to find your champions. And research continuously shows us that teens are much more likely to delay drinking when they feel they have a close, supportive tie with a parent or a guardian. And parents are definitely champions in several ways in the efforts to reduce underage drinking. So make sure these champions are at your coalition table. Lastly, in terms of lessons that I have personally learned, is that it's really important to surround yourself with smart people. And I cannot stress the importance of surrounding yourself with your coalition and having that access to qualified people and knowledgeable people for policy work. And I'm much more comfortable talking about alcohol and special events restrictions. That's our next topic. But honestly, when it comes to alcohol restrictions, I keep myself on a very short leash, a very, very short leash, because there are legal implications of restricting advertising. And although something seems to make sense, or it seems to be for the common good, oftentimes I ask myself, well, who wouldn't support this? How could this be a bad thing? That doesn't make it legal. And I'm thankful that I have access to several consultants who will explain things to me. They'll think through things with me. They'll play devil's advocate and review legal aspects and help point me in the right direction. And I certainly hope you can establish that same support system so that you can get advertising restrictions on the books in your community, but do it in a way where it passes and doesn't cause a lot of challenges or problems within your community. So switching gears just for a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about these community festivals. So we'll do an introduction here, and then Chuck will come back and go over some information. But I want you to kind of think about within your community, or nearby communities perhaps, what festivals that your community is known for. So I have down here, and I hate to do this to you because that sweet corn looks fantastic and we're several months away from it at this point, but in Normal, Illinois, we always have a sweet corn circus, and it really is a celebration of all things sweet corn. Our fields in Illinois are filled with sweet corn by midsummer, and we certainly have a big celebration. And then I oftentimes think about the Taste of Chicago, an event that brings people from multiple states into the city of Chicago to really sample the wonderful food and culture that Chicago has to offer. So I want you to kind of be thinking about maybe festivals in your community, and some of our presenters and hosts for this webinar mentioned, okay, we've got a sweet corn festival in Iowa. So yes, I would bet Iowa is filled with corn in the middle of summer too. Country USA and Rock USA. I'm going to go out on a limb and bet that maybe alcohol is tied into that. The Wisconsin State Fair. I know state fairs are incredibly important and bring people together. A Midsummer Fest and Rib Fest. Okay, so you're probably making yourself hungry as you think about these too. So kind of keep thinking about these. And I'm going to have Chuck do kind of an introduction into our next topic, which is alcohol and really working to have some good policies and restrictions in place at special events. I'm going to turn it over to you, Chuck.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. So once again, I want to give you a quick overview about the policy we're going to move into is looking at restrictions on alcohol itself. Again, that might be street fairs, sporting events, concerts, a whole host of things, as you heard Kelly just talk about. The objective here is to reduce the commercial availability of alcohol to underage youth. So again, with that goal in mind, restrictions, typical elements of these kinds of restrictions is, again, you start with sort of evaluating your current policies, thinking about having some expertise in policy language, as we talked about in the other policy, looking at alcohol serving and possession issues, enforcement limitation, considering media advocacy, already mentioned, but again, sort of reiterating that link. Again, it's in terms of outcomes. It's linked to reductions in underage drinking and consequences. Also linked to reductions in neighborhood calls for complaints about those events and reductions in actual sales to pseudo-underage customers. So all decent outcomes worth considering exploring this kind of a policy, and bring it back to Kelly to talk about on the ground, what does alcohol restrictions look like?
All right. Thanks, Chuck. So, you've thought about some of those community events, maybe even events that you've attended as a young child and have been part of kind of your process of growing into adulthood. And I often think about and, reminisce about community events. They evoke happy memories for me and good times. And I remember fondly attending the Illinois State Fair as a child. It was good food. It was good music. We got to ride all the rides and play games, lots of activities. And I remember a very, very large beer tent in the middle of it all. I remember, going to the church down the street. And, they'd host a carnival each year. And it was a big deal. There was good food, good music, rides, games, activities, and a very, very large beer tent. And these events, probably similar to maybe the events you're thinking about, weren't really about the alcohol. And these events might have even downplayed the alcohol. But therein lies the challenge. Many of these events are long-standing, community-embedded events that bring about happy times for community members. Alcohol may not be central to the event, but if alcohol is present at the event, it can provide an access point for underage drinking. And that's why proper precautions, processes, and policies really need to be in place. Additionally, special events with clear alcohol policies and procedures send a clear message that consumption of alcohol by youth is not acceptable. Removing the sale of alcohol altogether from these events, it may not be an option. Because remember, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In today's discussion, we're really looking at finding that balance. We wish that alcohol could be removed from these events, but it's not going to be. So we're going to kind of work towards that. How can we have a safe and enjoyable event? And we're going to work to get all our ducks in a row. Community events can be economic drivers for community organizations and nonprofits. So many communities, and moreover, organizations and nonprofits, really are feeling the financial squeeze of funding reductions. There's this constant overarching pressure to do more with less. We're anxious to find ways to diversify funds. We want to create a rainy day account and obtain those unrestricted dollars. Fundraising is key to many organizations and nonprofit survival. So eliminating the sale of alcohol can greatly reduce an event's profit. Along with that, community events often support worthy causes. Events don't always provide direct funding for an organization or not-profit. Sometimes a service club will come together, and they'll fund all kinds of community initiatives through an event. A service club might host a beer and brats tournament and then turn around and provide support to an animal rescue, a homeless shelter, a children's reading initiative, support to a veterans hospital. These are all worthy causes. So the discussion changes a bit, and instead of focusing on eliminating alcohol sales, it really becomes more focused on working with your event coordinators to establish the best practices and processes possible to ensure underage youth do not have access to alcohol, and it's far out of sight and it's far out of mind as possible for our young people. Another challenge, and this is something that we've really had to deal with some of our events in Central Illinois, is volunteers are often the workforce for a community event. In the world of community events, free labor means more profit. So unfortunately, though, volunteers are often given the responsibility of selling and serving alcohol with little knowledge of the risks of underage drinking and very little knowledge on proper selling and serving techniques. If you don't work in the world of substance use prevention, you just may not be as in tune to these issues, and sometimes volunteers just don't know what they don't know. We also know that it can be really time-consuming the first year to create policies and procedures for alcohol sales and service. For event coordinators who have had, little need up to this point for documentation or written policies, the process for identifying the steps needed to ensure the event focuses on safe alcohol selling and serving, it can be very overwhelming. When we say, well, let's create a guidebook, let's create a handbook, that seems tedious to them. And, oftentimes they realize the amount of time this is going to take, and that, again, is overwhelming. So we really want to make sure that we help people understand that we can look at different policies and procedures that other communities have put in place and kind of see where those might fit, so perhaps we're not starting at ground zero again. And it's important to create a safe environment throughout the event, and not just at that immediate area where alcohol is sold. So we're really asking everyone to think very broadly, not just about maybe that beer tent or that area where the beer tent is, but throughout our festival or throughout our event. A lot of thought can be put into the arrangement of, the alcohol tent, the entrance, and the sales area, but also make sure everybody's thinking about restrooms and parking areas. Those should be monitored. You don't want alcohol consumption going out really for anyone going on in a parking lot. You don't want somebody walking into a restroom and leaving alcohol there for a young person to come pick up. The alcohol service area should have separate restrooms that are not accessible unless you're in that restricted area where the alcohol is sold and consumed. And there should be no passing through the alcohol service area to get to other parts of the event. That sometimes causes all kinds of problems. You just kind of zip through there and get to the other side of the event, and that shouldn't occur in any way. You want to look at stable fencing options, and you surround the entire area, including having some, porta potties if needed inside there. You want to have wristbands applied with very little extra space around the wrist. And it is okay to verify, even if somebody has a wristband on, it's okay to still verify that they are of age. So those, again, just some challenges. But here again, I think it's important to talk about some of those lessons learned, because we can get caught up in how this is going to be hard work. There's a lot of challenges. Yeah, there will be, but there's a lot of things that we can do to really move these policy efforts forward based on lessons that have been learned. So much like advertising restrictions, building broad support for alcohol restrictions helps ensure both a safe and enjoyable event. And here again, you're kind of leveraging issues with your audience. While you may be focused on reducing underage drinking, there are a host of issues that alcohol restrictions at community events really do address. So it can be advantageous to leverage that support based on many different safety aspects. So, going the route of talking about when we have these alcohol restrictions and policies and processes in place, it will also help us address over-service of alcohol, public intoxication, impaired driving, public disturbances, vandalism, litter, and destruction of property. I know a lot of times with community events, people will say the aftermath and the pickup and the litter cleanup is so extensive and so costly. Well, perhaps that's a way to leverage an issue to make sure that you put some policies and procedures in place, because it's going to reduce underage drinking, but sure, it'll also take care of that litter cleanup as well. So what can we kind of tie together for the good of the community? It really is a common theme that, again, we want to bring together our local stakeholders. As you'll look to establish these policies and procedures for alcohol at a special event, think of the stakeholders who will advocate for creating a safe and enjoyable event. Law enforcement must be a part of the conversation. But beyond that, you want to have your local businesses involved, churches, parents, youth, substance use prevention agencies, treatment agencies, schools, and any other organization who might have a natural stake in events focusing on reducing youth alcohol access or just creating safer, healthier events. And we know that community coalitions can lighten the load. Coalitions often naturally bring together sectors of the community that should be represented during event planning. And so if you're not working with a coalition, perhaps look around and reach out to that local coalition, especially if it's a prevention coalition. Often community coalitions have access to resources, there's trainings, webinars, and even sometimes they have access to consultants who can provide communities with some guidance and assistance. You're going to want to check your local ordinances and community mass gathering permits. If a special event has been operating for several years, there's likely a lot of pieces in place already. But if this is a special event that's new and it's the first year, there are a lot of details that need to be in place for that event to move forward. You'll need to know if a permit is required, and I can tell you most of the time that is true. You'll need a permit. You want to know how much that mass permit costs. What is the liquor licensing process? Are permits transferable? Will you need some sort of inspection? What are the insurance issues, zoning issues, mass gathering permits? You've even got to be aware of what your fire marshal requirements are. So the best advice I have here is not trying to figure everything out on your own, but making sure part of your planning committee or your event committee is really going to include some key people at the municipal level. So your local officials, perhaps the municipal legal counsel, because they're going to be able to assist you with issues around things like clean water, sewer, food, and sanitary services. They'll also be able to help you put in place some processes for emergency medical and public safety. So the list goes on, but here again, not to scare you away, because the more planning we can do up front with the right people, the less we have to do on the back end. Another lesson learned is that, finding a server training balance for your event volunteers. While in Illinois, we do require that an on-premise alcohol server be Bassett certified, this requirement does not apply to a volunteer who's serving alcohol beverages at a charitable function. So you'll want to check with your state and community requirements on server training requirements. It's critical, though, to make sure that those who are serving alcohol have a clear understanding of their responsibilities for both service and selling. Consider creating a pre-event training that all volunteers attend, and it will focus on what those best practices are for selling and the service of alcohol. You want to make sure that you have this process in place for helping volunteers understand how to check an ID This has become problematic in Illinois. I can't speak for the other states, but, fake IDs right now are rampant. And it certainly is worth the time to really work with your volunteer force to identify that process of how you properly do check an ID. Written policies and procedures should be presented to those who will be selling and serving alcohol. I would also include a form that each volunteer signs that indicates that they did listen to. They've read the information that you've provided, and they will uphold all those alcohol policies and procedures. Along with that, though, volunteers should be supervised by an event coordinator, or coordinators, hopefully, who have had a full course on alcohol selling and service practices, and they should be there at all times to address any volunteer questions and help with any concerns. Lastly, I'm just going to note that, volunteers should always be sober when serving and not drinking alcohol products while selling and serving alcohol. That kind of goes without saying, but I do want to mention that. We want to have all policies and procedures in writing. You're going to have a hard time enforcing what isn't in writing. So you want to have those policies and procedures down on paper and available for review at any time. We also want to invest the time and energy to debrief after the event. Before the event occurs, put that meeting on the schedule so that everyone prioritizes that on this date after our event, we will come together and we'll talk about kind of what went well and what we need to change as we move forward. It'll allow you to really look at what processes can be replicated in the future and make those changes where necessary so that next time the event occurs, things go more smoothly. Our memory fades quickly, and it's important to get this information down on paper within a week of the event. So make sure you gather some feedback from local law enforcement as well. They may come forward and say, well, here's kind of what we know after the event. Here's some issues we had. How can we deal with these before the next event so that we've got a good process in place? So really just bringing everybody back to the table and making the changes that you need to know. And again, all of this is to work towards helping your community find that balance so that it's both a safe and enjoyable event, and that underage drinking really, there are some processes in place to make sure that our young people are protected. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you during this webinar. On the next page, I just want to kind of mention some resources. This is the Prevention First webpage. We have a tab up top where you would just click on Alcohol Policy Resource Center. And we have tabs that have fact sheets and then tools and resources. So a few things that I want to draw your attention to. We do have fact sheets on both advertising restrictions and special events and alcohol restrictions. And then we have under tools and resources a brand new community guide on alcohol and best practices of selling alcohol at community events. So I'd welcome you to come look at that information. It'll give you some checklists on things that you can do step by step to make sure that you will, really follow what we've learned along the way as some really good processes to get some of those really solid community best practices in place. So having said that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck, and I thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you today.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I want to remind everybody there'll be some additional resources that you can download as this webinar is posted. You'll see some additional information regarding much of the outcome and information I mentioned earlier on. I, again, want to express my appreciation to Kelly and other folks helping with today's webinar, and want to turn this over to Ann, who will talk us through this last piece.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Kelly. I just want to make sure that people are aware this is part 1. There is a part 2, and both of these webinars will be posted on our website. It will also give you an opportunity to ask questions as part of a survey. We will post that on our website. You will have approximately a week to ask questions. After we get those questions, we'll have them answered and post all of the answers on our website as well. I want to again thank everyone who was part of this webinar, and we will look forward to our second webinar that will be in early April. Thank you very much.